Hey church, and welcome to this week's small group. Now on Sunday we asked the very difficult question, why does God allow His children to go through tough times? And we came to the conclusion that when we are weak, then we are made strong. And this series is all about the book of James. And what's interesting about this series is that we're not preaching through the book of James. We're actually doing a Bible study through the book of James, but those studies are actually pushing the sermons. And so what I want you to do is just start out, read James chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Who is the author of this letter, and who are the intended recipients of this letter? Because the book of James is a letter. And what is the purpose of hardship or trials in a believer's life? So obviously James is the author of this letter. But some of the things that you may not know about James is that James is actually the blood brother of Jesus Christ. He was a half-brother of Jesus. A lot of people think that Jesus didn't have siblings, but he actually did. And James was also the leader of the Jerusalem church. A lot of people think that Paul was the big kahuna, but in reality it was James, the brother of Jesus, that was the leader of the Jerusalem church. And this letter that he wrote was addressed to Jewish Christians. So next I want you to read verses 4 through 8. Why is perseverance important in the life of a believer? Where are we supposed to find wisdom according to these passages? And what is the result of doubt in a believer's life? Now this next passage is a little bit difficult to understand, but I want you to keep this in mind as you read this next passage. Keep in mind that Jesus several times throughout the Gospels says to humble ourselves, because he says that the humble will be exalted, but the people who are exalted will be humbled. I can only imagine James, as he grew up, hearing his older brother saying that several times as he grew up. The humble will be exalted, but the exalted will be humbled. I want you to keep this concept in mind as you read these next few verses. Read verses 9 through 11. What do these passages instruct us to take our pride in? What eventually happens to the wealthy and their wealth? And what is the inherent danger of wealth? Let's look at the common denominators between the person of humble circumstances in those passages and the wealthy person. James commends the humble person for their humility, and his advice to the wealthy is to also be humble. You see, trials are the common denominator, and they are the great equalizer. None of us is immune to trials, and they eventually bring us all to the same level. We all end up dying, and our wealth ends up evaporating. So the question is what have you invested your life in that actually matters and that actually lasts? The danger of wealth is that there is a temptation to rely on wealth rather than to rely on God. It's my desire as your pastor that you be able to be a very wealthy, financially wealthy person. However, it's also my desire as a pastor that you don't depend on that wealth. Next, I want you to read James chapter 1, verses 12 through 15. What is the difference between a trial and a temptation? And where does temptation come from, and how do we stop it from developing to death? What I want you to see from this passage is that God allows trials, but He does not tempt us. There's a difference between trial and temptation. One God has His hand in, and the other one God does not. We need to own up to our own temptations because they come from within. They're our own desires that we cultivate. Next, I want you to read James chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. Why is it important to recognize where good things come from? And what does the word birth in verse 18 refer to? Nobody likes hardships or trials. If you do, there's probably something wrong with you. But the problem is that most people live in fear of hardships. So how do these scriptures change our perspective on hardships? And now I want you to apply this to your own life. How will you handle your next hardship differently? After you're done answering those questions, close in prayer and ask God to not allow us to waste our times of hardship, but to use them to perfect our faith. Most of the times, when it comes to hardship, we waste it complaining when God is trying to do something huge on the inside. Have a great rest of your small group. Remember that when we are weak, it is then we are made strong, and we'll see you on Sunday.